Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're delighted that you could all join us tonight, and I will encourage anybody who is by the door and would like to sit down. There are still chairs scattered throughout, and there is an aisle in the middle, so you won't have to push past people to sit down. We're so thankful that you all could be here, both in person and virtually, for the launch of Reclaiming Anishinaabe Law, Kinamaadiwin Inaakonigewin, and the Treaty Right to Education. I'd like to thank the University of Manitoba Press for publishing this book and making this evening possible in the first place, and like to thank all of you in advance for your forbearance with my clumsy settler tongue as we get through our opening comments. Thank you all. So I'll give you a quick rundown of what will be happening this evening, and then I'll invite up the first of our guests to speak. There'll be a presentation from Dr. Baskatawang here from the podium, and then following that, there'll be an opportunity for some brief questions about his reading. Following that, there'll be a conversation hosted by James Daschuk, which will take place at the seats to my left, and then there'll be another opportunity for you folks to ask questions about the content of that. Just to preemptively let you know, if you're here and have a question, please feel free to put up your hand and I'll run over to you with the microphone. This is not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that those watching at home can hear the question and prevents us from having to repeat it. If you are one of those people joining us online, please feel free to just write your question in the chat and we will get to you as time permits. I'll be back at the end of the night with some incredibly exciting news about how you can get a book signed. But before then, the only thing I'll put in your brain right now is that we'll ask that you just remain in place for one moment while we safely transport Leo to the signing table, at which point you'll be able to come over and get your book signed. But here to offer some opening comments, we have a very illustrious individual. So I'll just ask you to bear with me as I tell you a little bit about him before inviting him up to speak. Fred Kelly is a citizen of the Ojibways of Inaakonigewin, a community of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty Number 3. He is a member of the Lynx clan and is an elder in Midowin, the Sacred Law and Medicine Society of the Anishinaabe. As such, Fred is a keeper and practitioner of sacred law. He's also a drum keeper and a pipe carrier, and has been called upon to administer healing therapies among many Indigenous people on Turtle Island and to conduct sacred ceremonies across Canada and the United States, Mexico, Japan, Argentina, and Israel. Elder Kelly heads the Nokomis Healing Group and is a survivor of Indian Residential School in Kenora, Ontario, LaBrea, Saskatchewan. He was a member of the Assembly of First Nations team that negotiated the historic Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement and continues to advise individual victims on their healing journeys. Elder Kelly served as chief of his own community and is Grand Chief Emeritus of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. And was the Ontario Regional Director of the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs in Canada. In 1965, at the age of 23, he led the first protest march of its kind in Canada that is now known as the birth of the Indigenous civil rights movement in this country. He was one of the organizers of the National Indian Brotherhood and assisted in its transition to become the Assembly of First Nations. He organized the Chiefs of Ontario in 1975, then went on to play a key role in the negotiations that led to the recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights in the Canadian Constitution. Elder Kelly is a consensus builder who, among other activities, joined Canada, Harvard University, and Motorola in a major overhaul of the education system in Onegawin. He developed the strategic plan on treaty implementation for the Assembly of First Nations and authored the comprehensive strategic plan for the Chiefs in Ontario that incorporates the revitalization of nationhood and pre-contact treaties among Indigenous nations in the territory now known as Ontario. Elder Kelly has been operating a successful consultancy in strategic planning and management, negotiations and policy development, corporate governance for over 40 years. He is also a practitioner of traditional methods in conflict resolution, including mediation and other customary intervention approaches. Most recently, he served as spiritual advisor for the delegation of Indigenous peoples that traveled to the Vatican last year to receive an apology from the Pope for the atrocities committed in Canada's residential school system. It's my great pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming Elder Fred Kelly.
Bigas, de daar waren met toch. Je zou zeggen, maar gewoon die go, je weet dan je. We hebben dan zeggen dat je de kaas zorgen leske. We should do them, let me tell. What I have just said in my language is who I am, my spiritual name, my traditional name. And the first one, Gerval Samachwa, translates to kind, walk, and bear. And that I'm links is my clan. I'm in Medellin. And of all the beautiful words that have been said about me, I congratulate the reader of that. You read it just as I wrote it. I wish I had lived to all those good accomplishments as they have been read. My only accomplishment I can speak of today is to get up from that chair and walk over here. Those few steps that I have been able to do. And wanted to acknowledge all those beautiful people, those treaty partners of this part of Turtle Island. I also want to acknowledge the ancestors of our lands on Turtle Island, who have in fact given us the wisdom of the ages that we refer to as contemporary knowledge and wisdom that we translate to as contemporary education. I thank them because they are the ones that had the original law and how we educate. And one of those principal teachings and learnings that we learned was how to share. And so it was 150 years ago that one of our negotiators to Treaty Number 3, now known as the Northwest Angle of October 3rd, 1873, Chief Savageway said, getting close to the end of the negotiations of that treaty, he said, the time will come when we will ask you to lend us one of your sons and one of your daughters to lend us, to come and live with us. And we will teach them what we believe is good. And the time will come when we will exchange, I'm paraphrasing, because I believe that those verbatim words are going to be read out to you. But it's 150 years ago that these words were spoken, because it is the 150th anniversary of Treaty 3. And so those words of sharing our children certainly did not foreshadow what happened in the residential school system. And our children were taken away to be enslaved through a process of genocide. But I'm not here to talk to you about the politics of that. I'm here to share with you some of the joys of what has happened, even though that we have survived 150 years of many of those atrocities. And I'm not here to talk to you and regurgitate the pain and anguish. I'm here to share with you what was prophesied, in fact, when he said, we will lend you one of our children, and you will take one of our children to teach them that which is good, and they'll come back and teach us. That, I believe, is contained in this very book that you're going to read. The ancestors that have brought us to this contemporary situation, each and every one of you have a legacy on Turtle Island whether you be Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And those were the intentions. The spirit and intent of those treaties was to live in peace and harmony with one another. I have believed that this book here capsulizes that spirit and intent. So it is amazing to me, even though I'm familiar with those quotations, I'm familiar with the history of our people. It still is amazing to me that what people refer to as coincidence is not really coincidence. The word is synchronicity. What the Creator has divined by his sacred intervention, that our people would come together. For it is our people that believed long time ago that the Creator placed the yellows to the east, the blacks to the south, the reds to the west, and the whites to the north. And in time they would come together. And if they did not respect each other's ways, there would be conflict. We have lived in those times. As a result of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, and I acknowledge my brother Phil Fontaine, that invited me to advise him on this negotiation processes that gave rise also to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The time of reconciliation has arrived. It is timely that this book was also released in this time of reconciliation, 150 years after its chief savagery spoke those eloquent words in the Anishinaabe language. So I'm here to celebrate that. I'm here to celebrate that with you. And primarily, I wish to celebrate that with Leo's mother. And I haven't seen her yet. Where is she? Oh, here she is. There's a beaming, beautiful lady sitting in the front here. Her face is covered. I don't know why she wants to cover her beautiful face, but that is her prerogative. Because our parents, and this goes to you as well, every one of you who has attained education. The parents have seen the day, foresaw the day, but yet wondered, I wonder what my child is going to be when he or she grows up. I believe that my mother, who's now passed on some time ago, she's probably still wondering, I wonder what he'll ever be when he grows up. But here I am, doing my best. I also celebrate with a beautiful family that Leo has brought in his family right here. His relations are here. It's a family affair. Yes, but not being true as they are, kind people. They don't celebrate by themselves. They want to celebrate this beautiful day with you. And that's why I share that with you as well, because Leo and I have formed a close relationship. Leo has become my adopted son. And I am honored that he's made arrangements for me to be here, to share this with him. I also share that with each and every one of you who has taken the time to be here and who has taken the time to be reading this book, because this is the historical truth that is interpreted by a modern day scholar, a very intelligent person. Leo, in my view, and you will understand that I'm somewhat biased, but even before we became father and son in relationship, is a man I admire for his accomplishments, including his beautiful family, his relations, his uncles, all those that are here, doing with great respect to the ancestry that we have on this land. And so I want to just say, in jest, somebody told me, did you know that Leo's finished his book? I said, I didn't know he was reading one. Here it is. It's got a feather on it, and it's, to me, this is the beginning of what Chief Savagery had talked about. Each and every one. I've also proud to tell you that in this form of education and sharing with that I also have my niece's mother here. She is now a professor at Harvard University. In 1965, during that march, one of the things I said about the treaty rights is that we're not asking for your love. We're not asking for anything else, but the equality of opportunity. And if you share that equality of opportunity with us, we will stand with you shoulder to shoulder in the academic world, in the professional world of medicine and all other professions. We have reached that part, and Leo today epitomizes it, though so does my niece in Harvard, Shawan Kinu. Her mother's right here as well with us. So those of you, you look at your children and you wonder, you hope for the best, you wish for the best. And in the kindness of the Creator, the Great Spirit allows these children to become what they want to be. Whereas in this book, not for us to determine what they must be, but give them the freedom to be what they want to be, as Leo, Dr. Leo, as I call him, epitomizes. It is my honor to congratulate and ask you to join me in a round of applause for Dr. Leo. My boy. And thank your mother for sharing, allowing me to share you and his wife and to share his children. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elder Kelly. I now have the unenviable task of following that up to introduce tonight's participants. That was beautiful. A graduate of the University of Manitoba, PhD in history in 2002, your host, James Daschuk, seated to my left, is a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies at the University of Regina and a research associate with the Saskatchewan Population Health and Evaluation Research Unit. His book, Clearing the Plains, Disease, the Politics of Starvation and the Loss of Aboriginal Life, which was published in 2013, won numerous prizes, including the Canadian Historical Association Sir John A. Macdonald Prize for the Best Work in Scholarly History in 2014. Since its publication, it has sold more than 35,000 copies and was recently released as an audiobook. We also view Clearing the Plains as one of the cornerstone books of our store, and it has not left our shelves since its publication. Dr. Leo Baskatawang is Anishinaabe from Baskatawang First Nation and Treaty 3 territory. He is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. Prior to beginning his academic career, Dr. Baskatawang served in the United States Army, where he completed 2 combat tours with distinction. Please join me in welcoming him.
Bonjour, hoje eu acho que você bem Indigenous, Before I begin, I think it's important to make clear that my decision to introduce myself in my native language, Anishinaabe, represents a conscious and explicit act of self-determination as well as cultural resurgence. As I've written in my book, I'm not fluent in Anishinaabe, and the primary reason for that is because of systemic forces that have been imposed by settler colonial state, which were specifically designed to erase Indigenous identity, as well as the state's constitutional obligations in order to facilitate the dispossession of land and inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. That said, I wish to thank you all for coming to my book launch. I'm truly grateful for all the support I have received tonight. In particular, I'd like to give a special shout out to a few individuals who've helped to make this event happen. First, Elaine Lyons, who organized the book launch, as well as to Sarah Enns from the marketing team, and to Glenn Bergen and Jill McConkey from U of M Press, who are my editors and are really the ones that brought this book to life. So miigwech. Secondly, I'd also like to thank everyone here at McNally Robinson who agreed to host this event at this location here this evening, and it is much appreciated. Third, of course, I owe a very special thank you to Elder Fred Kelly for being here this evening. To put it briefly, this book would not have been possible without his guidance and mentorship. I tried my best to reflect the wisdom and knowledge he shared with me about Indigenous law in the pages of this book. As he mentioned, he is like a father to me, and considering that I grew up without a father figure in my life, that really does mean the world to me. So I can only hope that I made him proud with the writing of this book. Fourth, I'd also like to thank Dr. James Daschuk for taking the time out of his busy schedule to be here this evening in order to participate in this book launch. As a colonial settler, I think it's important to have an important ally for Indigenous peoples across Canada, and I'm tremendously grateful for the foreword that he contributed to my book. His voice not only lends credibility to what I have written, but also demonstrates how Indigenous people and colonial settlers can work together to make a better life for us all. Finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Faculty of Law, as well as my family and friends that came here this evening to support my book launch, many of whom have traveled a long distance, including Dr. James Daschuk here, who came from Regina, and then Elder Fred Kelly came all the way from Aurelia, Ontario. My Aunt Clementine came all the way from Sioux Lookout, Ontario. My mom, who took time off work as a truck driver to be here this evening, and many thanks to everyone else here. I'm gonna go off script here for a minute, but basically, obviously I've been thinking about this event all day today, and I was really nervous, you know, like the weather was out there, and I had a few people tell me that to call and cancel, and so I wasn't sure what to expect, but like to see this today, like my heart is truly filled with joy, because like this really exceeded my best hopes and what I imagined was possible for this event. So thank you so much for everyone being here tonight. All right, so before I read an excerpt from the book, I figured it'd probably be helpful for you if I were to begin with a brief overview of what the book is actually about. So I think the first thing you'll notice when you pick up the book, obviously, is its cover. Aside from the title, you'll notice that there's an eagle feather on there. As many of you probably know, the eagle feather has become an important symbol for Indigenous people since it has come to be associated with Indigenous culture, spirituality, thought, and epistemology. That said, historically, an eagle feather, like its true meaning and purpose, was awarded to individuals in an Indigenous community for acts of deed that demonstrate bravery, truth, wisdom, respect, love, honesty, and/or humility, all of which you may know form the 7 sacred teachings of the Anishinaabe. But I also wish to mention that this practice is not just something that happened a long time ago or in the past, but something that continues to be practiced today to individuals who deserve them. Another thing I want to point out about the cover is that the white on it is intended to represent birch bark, which also has deep significance for Indigenous peoples. Aside from its utility to make such things as canoes and fire, the Anishinaabe also used it as a writing device, which was made to preserve important messages and stories. So the inclusion of it here on the cover is obviously a nod of respect to that age-old practice. Lastly, I think it's worth pointing out that if you look closely at the lettering of the title, you'll see that it is an image of a forest. The idea there was to represent Indigenous people's relationship to the land. The land is not only where we are born and laid to rest, but is also our teacher and our mother. And it is that connection to land what inspires Indigenous worldviews. Once you open the book, the first thing that I say is that it's dedicated to the people of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. And being a member of that nation, I can say without reservation that we have suffered tremendous harms and injustices at the hands of the Canadian government and its institutions over an extended period of time, pretty much since our treaty was signed back in 1873. This book is partly meant to give voice to that legacy of injustice, but more so, I hope it represents a beacon of hope on how we can move forward as a society in the spirit of reconciliation. In the introduction, I share a little bit about myself and my family, as far as where we come from and some of the struggles that we have endured to get to where we're at today. I also explain what the book is about, how it's organized, and why I chose to use the references that I cite throughout the book. With that said, there are 5 chapters in the book. In chapter 1, I discuss the historical context of colonization and its impact on Indigenous nations. In that regard, I talk about how the education system has been a primary tool for colonial agents to displace Indigenous peoples from their land and resources, as well as their governance systems, in order to accumulate wealth. And although we might be tempted to say that this type of injustice is a thing of the past, I argue in this book that these practices still continue today. Consequently, I argue that if we as Canadians are serious about reconciliation, then we must recognize and affirm that all Indigenous nations have their own laws and governance systems, and we should therefore provide the means for them to establish their own education systems in accordance with their own traditional values and beliefs. This is in line with what was promised in the treaties, as well as what's been stated in the TRC's calls to action, and what is written in the articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In chapter 2, I talk about how the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 has an inherent right to governance that was bestowed upon it at the beginning of time by the creator, Gitchimanatu, which has since been passed down from generation to generation through the oral tradition. From there, I draw on critical social theorists such as Jacques Derrida to analyze what it means to write. First, through the power or authority that is given to the written word. Secondly, the limitation of such forms of writing, such that it tends to be locked or frozen in time. And I also ask the reader to consider that other forms of writing might actually exist, including, among other practices, the use of language itself through stories. Following a brief outline of the 4 eras of treaty making in Canada, which includes the pre-contact era, the peace and friendship era, the Confederation era, and now in the modern era, I discuss how treaties have been interpreted in Canadian courts, as well as by Indigenous elders and scholars themselves. Chapter 3, I finally get to the point about the education law, Kinamaadiwin Inaakonigewin, and the circumstances that gave rise to its written form. This, of course, has to do with the abject failure of the residential school system, but also the inadequacy of the present public education system in Canada. So based on those circumstances, I talk about how the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 and its government developed a 5-fold purpose, as well as 7 guiding principles that ought to be observed in the development of a written education law. Part of this analysis includes identifying what the lawmaking process is for our people, as well as a consideration of what needs to happen in order to establish a Treaty 3 education system, such as the development of a Treaty 3 Education Commission and a Community Education Council, which would work together to design and implement culturally correct administration policies and procedures for the corresponding system. Although these are things that the Anishinaabe can do for themselves, One of the things I point out is that when it actually comes to putting shovels in the ground and putting the nuts and bolts of the education system together, at some point the federal government has to be counted on to deliver on the promises it made during the treaty negotiations, as well as its commitment to fill the TRC's calls to action, as well as to implement UNDRIP. And that, of course, requires a sufficient amount of funding. So that leads me to chapter 4, where I basically say that the Canadian government has taken an important step towards reconciling its relationship with Indigenous nations in terms of publicly stating that reconciliation is important and that it needs to happen. But I go on to say that without concrete, observable action in the form of financial resources, these statements merely constitute benign gestures of recognition. Therefore, in order to truly fulfill its commitment to reconciliation, I argue that the federal government must actually affirm its rhetoric by actually doing something about it. Hence, the chapter is called Reconciliation as Recognition and Affirmation. For those here that are unaware, the language of recognize and affirm is drawn from Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which states, and I quote, "The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed." As such, I take the position that the federal government has a constitutional obligation to fulfill its promise that it has made. In the last chapter, titled Reflections, I basically summarize the main points that I make throughout the book and offer some reflections from my experience working with the Grand Council Treaty 3. And since I've often been asked how Indigenous education should be funded, one of the suggestions I put forth is to create a new reconciliation tax that would be added onto the GST, which I argue has as much symbolic import as it does material. That is in the sense that each and every Canadian would be contributing to the reconciliation process, however small that contribution might be. Another idea is to settle on a share of revenue from the taxes that are already gathered from land-based industry. The idea there would be to have the wealthiest pay their fair share for those in need, and in the process, recalibrate the distribution of wealth. And so that pretty much covers it. I think, therefore, before I read an excerpt from the book, I might just quickly see if there's any really burning questions out there that can't wait till our more formalized question and answer period.
I hope they don't ask my question.
Okay, so with that said, you know, I do appreciate and respect the fact that you guys will patiently wait for the Q&A period, so thank you for that. That said, I do have a section of the book I would like to read. It was with great difficulty for me to choose something, but I finally settled on something that I think not only kind of describes what the Treaty 3 education law is about, but it also shares some of the guidance and wisdom that was offered to me by Fred Kelly, while also sharing a personal anecdote from my own personal history with an experience I share with my Aunt Clementine. Okay, so for those of you following along, I'm at page 94 under the heading, The Purpose and Principles of a Treaty 3 Education Law. So basically at this point in the book, I'm kind of talking about like the process that I was going through as far as what Grand Council was doing, like the literature that was available in their archives. And this is after we had some meetings with youth and elders, as well as education personnel. And so by this time, I had done quite a bit of work, and I had seen that this idea of writing an education law had been a burning issue for many years. And so I'm picking up the conversation here where they started re-talking about it again around 2008. So Following a brief hiatus of political action in the 2000s, the development of a written national education law gathered momentum in 2007 at the annual Elders Gathering in Kenora, Ontario. There, the assembled elders determined a fivefold purpose of a written education law for the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. Number 1, to preserve the Anishinaabe in the student. Number 2, to protect the language and cultural identity of the student. Number 3, to provide an education that enables the student to become a functional citizen in the Anishinaabe Nation and society at large. Number 4, to clarify relationships between the Grand Council and other governments in Canada. And number 5, to harmonize administration of Anishinaabe law in education and administration of Crown government laws in education. These imperatives are to be understood in conjunction with Elder Fred Kelly's thesis that the central purpose of establishing a written education law is to, and I quote, exercise the inherent jurisdiction in education of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 now and for future generations, end quote. Which is to say, exercise our inherent right to self-determination and cultural sovereignty. For the Anishinaabe, the concept of sovereignty relates to a word in Anishinaabe known as debendawism, which translates loosely to sacred freedom. As Elder Kelly goes on to explain, debendawism is the sacred gift of the Anishinaabe Nation to do whatever is necessary to achieve all its legitimate ends that come from the Creator and the ancestors, including the inherent right to its system of governance, laws and institutions, citizenship, trade and commerce, and the right to enter into treaties with other nations. Although the revitalization of any traditional law can enhance the distinctive social, economic, and political well-being of an Indigenous nation, education is especially important in the sense that the nation is making a conscious and targeted investment in the generations of tomorrow. Thus, by establishing an education law that facilitates the construction of a localized Anishinaabe education system, the students of the education system can benefit in multiple ways. Some of these benefits include the following. A, fully develop one's individual potential as distinct Anishinaabe members living in a modern era while also honoring one's heritage. B, engage in studies with high academic standards, as well as technical studies and skilled trades, land-based learning for traditional knowledge and institutional learning. C, become fluent in Anishinaabe and ensure cultural transmission of the oral history to the next generation. D, develop a connection to the land, a key, and gain a sense of responsibility to care for the land using traditional knowledge systems. E, engage in learning opportunities with Anishinaabe elders, knowledge holders, and oral historians so that they can transmit their knowledge to the next generation of youth for maintaining the strength of the culture and language and the living civilization of the nation. F, understand the nature of Indigenous rights from an international perspective. Know the inherent rights of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 and become competent to speak to those rights publicly and transmit the knowledge to future generations. G, promote a sense of social responsibility and tolerance for the belief of others in a global community. And finally, H, understand the importance of contributing to the social, economic, political, and spiritual development of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. So in 2008, Treaty 3 elders again met for an open discussion to provide direction and guidance for the initiation and development of a written law on education. At this gathering, the elders established 7 guiding principles that are to be observed in the development of a written education law. So it should come as no surprise that with the declining use of our language, the first guiding principle was related to Anishinaabe, language revitalization. In particular, the elders were concerned about how younger generations were being ridiculed for their imprecise pronunciation of Anishinaabe words, which deterred youth from learning and speaking the language. The ridicule suffered by younger generations, however, has not been limited just to the way we talk, but also to the way we look and the way we act. In Real Indians and Others, Mixed Blood, Urban Native Peoples, and Indigenous Nationhood, Benita Lawrence describes an instance when, and I quote, one woman mentioned how her mother would scold her in Cree whenever she grew her hair long, telling her that she looked like a big, thick Indian, end quote. And I too can recall a time when my aunt called me a real Anishinaabe for not knowing how to operate an outboard motor, with the implication that real Anishinaabe know nothing of modern technology. With regard to that example, I think it is important to mention that my aunt's phrase was actually saturated with irony and thus a joke. We have a weird way of joking with each other, okay? So among my family, I am different in the sense that I grew up and still live in an urban environment. At the cost of not learning how to speak my language and having only episodic experiences of common cultural practices such as fishing, hunting, and trapping. As a result of my limited experience, I grew up with a general sense of detachment from the rest of my family. Most of my extended family, conversely, grew up and continue to live on or near the land where they were born and raised. Because of their upbringing on the land, almost all of my uncles, aunts, and cousins acquired and developed skills in fishing and hunting at an early age. Thus, as a 14-year-old out on the land, I was expected to have the basic knowledge of firing up an outboard motor, taking us from place to place, and knowing where all the good fishing spots were. But as I mentioned, I did not grow up that way, so I did not have such experience or knowledge yet. Therefore, as I was struggling to get us going, my aunt identified an opportunity to rip a joke at my expense. The irony was that if I were a real Anishinaabe, I would have known what the hell I was doing as opposed to being an obvious city slicker. Should I read a little bit more? Okay. I had one more paragraph I wanted to read, so I might as well do it. So unfortunately for many peoples, or for many Indigenous peoples, the ridicule that they experience from family members is often symptomatic and indicative of an internalization of colonization as a result of their family members' own acute experiences of colonization, which then develops into intergenerational trauma. As Anishinaabe scholar Sheila Cote-Meek explains, these effects, and I quote, have largely been passed from one generation to another as a direct result of unresolved historical trauma, end quote. And they originate from the loss of lives, land, and vital aspect of Native culture promulgated by the European conquest of the Americas. Thus, to address this problem, it was decided at the 2008 Elders Gathering that a safe and supporting learning environment must be developed, one that reflects our Anishinaabe identity, values, and beliefs. The elders determined, in accordance with the 7 Generations Education Institute, that the first guiding principle for Anishinaabe education is to revitalize and maintain our way of speaking, our way of processing and expressing thought, our way of communicating with the creation, with the spirit, and with one another. It is to ensure that the connection of our language to our worldview, language to culture, language to relatedness and identity, and language to the natural environment. As such, the Treaty 3 education law ensures that Anishinaabe will be the first language of the education system. In this system, Kinamaadiwin Inaakonigewin states that the students will be encouraged to speak Anishinaabe as their first language, with the objective of every school and learning lodge being to graduate students who are equally proficient in Anishinaabe as they are in English. To help accomplish this task, it was further decided that the teaching staff and administrative staff of every school and learning lodge will use Anishinaabe to their greatest possible extent as their language of work, including as a language of instruction for course content. Given these objectives, a section of the draft education law is dedicated specifically to the use and priority of our language. And so that's what I had for you guys today.
Well, thanks, Leo. That was great. A couple of things. I was blown away by reading your book. I was honored to write it forward. Got something for you though. Okay. I was thinking about you as a truly unique academic in Canada, right? And in your book, you talked about, talking is fine, saying you're sorry is fine, but you got to follow through. Mm-hmm. And so when I was, when we were getting to know each other, when I was reading the manuscript, you, as a young man, you volunteered for the 101st Airborne Battalion, became a warrior. Oh, geez, okay. And then, we're celebrating you as an academic this evening, right? So you've taken on that role. Mm-hmm. Something else, I guess I knew about you probably for more than a decade before we met in person, right? Back in 2011, 2012. Would you mind sharing with the audience your performance art?
Yeah, so what Jim's referring to is that I'm a man who wears many hats, right? So in this particular instance he's referring to in 2012 is when I was a master's student. I was paying attention to the news, and at this time around January 2012, there was this important Crown First Nations gathering that had assembled as far as, and they were talking about making changes to the Indian Act. Some of you might know what I'm talking about now. So anyway, but the thing is, what came from this gathering was nothing, right? It was just more lip service. Basically, I specifically remember them saying that it would be a year before they even come up with this progress report. And for me, that was just so unsatisfactory. I was really livid. And, I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, how do we continue to let this happen? And I realized at that time, if I have these strong, passions and emotions about it, then I owe it not to myself, but to my family, my community, everyone to try and do something about it. And I was aware of certain kind of strategies for protest, and one of which is to basically walk the land. And so basically I had this idea to chain a copy of the Indian Act to my waist and walk from Vancouver to Ottawa protesting the Indian Act. And at the time I wasn't sure, what was going to happen. But all I knew was that, if I did something like this, it's very likely that it's going to create some kind of awareness, and, hopefully, something good could happen. Anyway, and so that's kind of how things went down. So I started in Vancouver in April. And so, by the way, this thing was called March for Justice. It's something you can probably Google if you don't already know about it. So I started in April in Vancouver, and about halfway through, an important kind of event took place. And at the time, the the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was hosting a national event in Saskatoon. And I was invited to go speak there and talk about the Indian Act and its connection to the residential school system. And although, you know, like beginning, during, and after, I did not really receive a lot of media attention like for doing this. This was one of the more publicly accessible events that I did. And anytime I did have the opportunity to speak to media, I had two constant messages that I would always talk about. One was that if there's going to be you know, federal legislation about Indigenous peoples, it needs to be written by Indigenous peoples and for Indigenous peoples. Secondly, I would always talk about like how if you want to see change in your community, then you have a responsibility to go out there and seek that change for yourself. You cannot sit idle, right? I actually said this word idle. Now, fast forward a little bit, in Saskatoon, about 4 months later, 4 women gathered together and started talking about more injustice that was taking place, specifically in the form of some omnibus bill that the government was trying to push through, and ended up forming what became the Idle No More movement. And it was another interesting time. So this was percolating for a couple of months now in October, right? And by then I'd already done my march. But like while I was in Ottawa, I was contacted by people at the Assembly of First Nations, and they had invited me to speak at their annual national gathering that they have every December. And I was like, of course, no, I'd be happy to attend. And so December rolls around, and I basically make this statement again about the Indian Act, and again, its legacy of injustice and such. And again, you know, I make that, you know, passionate call. You know, if you want to see change, you have to go out and do it. You can't just sit here. And lo and behold, but the very next day, 4 chiefs storm into Parliament Hill. Like I remember it was Chief Isidore Day, Chief Patrick Madabi, Chief Fox. I can't remember the nation from, and one other. Oh, I think it was Derek Neepanak actually. So like the 4 of them storm into Parliament Hill and you know, demand to speak to Stephen Harper, and they want to like, you know, escalate this thing, you know. And it was just like this really fascinating time. And by that time, Idle No More had gained like quite a bit of traction. And as you might recall, in that time, in late 2012, early 2013, like it was like the top news story. Like they had like many events across Canada, but like the big one happened in Ottawa where they had gathered like thousands of people. And again, speaking about the injustice. And also simultaneously, there was Chief Teresa Spence, who was on a hunger strike. So all these things kind of coalesced together, right? And one of the things I kind of talk about in my book is maybe in some small way, I might have had some kind of influence on like those events that kind of rippled after. So there's that story.
And you literally ground down the Indian Act.
Yeah, exactly.
Like a lot of us professors say bad words about it, but like you walk the walk. So thank you for doing that. And like you said, it's a ripple effect, right? One of the things I was really struck by was almost like the poetry, the beauty of your writing. And one of the things that struck me, because in my work, I'm always talking about critical things, you know, epidemics and that kind of thing. And one of the images that really struck with me was you talked about colonialism as a Wendigo. And I'm sure a lot of people are kind of familiar with that. But do you want to just kind of explain that for the crowd?
Sure, I'll do my best. So in our culture, we have many different stories, right? And in a lot of these stories, there's different figures. One of the main ones is Nana Bojo. Of course, there's creation stories, Sky Woman. There's also Mishi Pishu, which is this guardian of the water, particularly around Lake Superior region. But also there's this other character called Wendigo. And the Wendigo is a very scary entity. Like, what I was taught from my mother as a child was that you can't whistle at night because it could call the Wendigo. And the Wendigo is this sort of like spirit kind of entity that craves like human flesh. It is literally like a cannibal. And so it's obviously in some ways like let's call it a villain. But it's also like a learning kind of tool as well. But the point is like this Wendigo has the potential to hurt people and things and, you know, values everything, right? And in my book, I use this metaphor of the Wendigo to describe colonization, because if you think about the process of colonization and what it's had, like as far as just really taking, extracting resources from the land without any kind of regard for like what the consequences may be and what might be left for the next generation. It is like almost like a virus that just like continually eats and has this insatiable appetite for land and resources. And so I use this Wendigo metaphor to kind of describe what colonization is.
Great, thank you. Another sort of metaphor you used was building a bridge from communities, say with Elder Kelly and the folks back in Ontario. I'm from Ontario as well. And you being the bridge, you know, like translating that service that you've done is taking those ancient traditions, those oral traditions, and literally put them to paper. So I'm just wondering, yeah, how you see that in your role at the university.
Yeah, no, thank you again. That's a great question. With my role, I would again go back to my personal history, and so I'll tell you a bit of story. I think I kind of share the story a little bit in the introduction of the book, because there is an about the author kind of section where I talk about my personal kind of experience, how I grew up and everything. And one of the key events actually happened when I dropped out of university. I was sort of like I don't know if I call myself an overachiever or an underachiever in high school, but basically I did well enough to get accepted at University of Manitoba. But the thing is I had no skills or experience like dealing with my own time or money. And as you know, like in high school, you basically have a teacher like basically shepherding you throughout the process, like constantly on you about making assignments, creating class time to do those kinds of things. And so I didn't ever worry about that in high school, but in university, it's a different story, right? Like the professor is not going to tell you or give you class time to do anything, or like, you know, look after you, make sure that you hand in an assignment on time or whatever. And you know, they're not going to tell you to show up to class. Like you're basically on your own, and you have to have this sort of mindset to be able to want to learn, right? And when I came out of high school, I wasn't there. I didn't have those skills. Fortunately for me, probably the best decision I made was dropping out of high school. At the time I was floundering in school. I had like a C plus average, and I realized I just was not ready for school. And so that kind of led me on this, you know, odyssey to like just like go from job to job. And I realized without education, you know, like it was almost gonna be impossible to get like a decent paying job. And then following that, realizing that my life was like kind of stalling right before my eyes, like this opportunity presented itself to join the US Army. And that's kind of where that experience came from, is like me kind of being stuck in neutral and watching my life pass by. And I recognized an opportunity to gain life experience, to go acquire new skills, see new places, and have like different experiences. So I did that for about almost 6 years. It took me to Iraq twice. I was there for 2 years altogether. And I learned the hard way, you know, what it means to be a war, to have that brotherhood of men in battle. like there were tough times that we had to deal with. I watched comrades die. And through that experience, I realized that what I had given up when I quit school, and I just all of a sudden made this kind of commitment. You know what? And here's the other thing. When I dropped out of school, I carried a tremendous burden on myself. I felt that I had let myself down. I felt that I had let my family down. I felt that I let my community down, my nation, and there's this tremendous guilt that I carried for like almost 7 or 8 years. And finally, when I was ready, when I finished my enlistment, and I knew what I wanted to do. I knew how important it was for me to give back to my community. And I knew that if I went back to school, that I would, learn all about the history of my people, colonization, methods for reconciliation, current events, all this stuff. I'd learn about our literature, our, epistemologies, our philosophy, like as much as I could possibly learn. That is what I wanted to do. And so that's what happened. I went through the process. In 2008, all of a sudden, I was a completely different student, I was engaged in class. I made an effort to talk to my professors, made sure like all my assignments were written. I was like ridiculously meticulous with keeping notes, all this stuff. And that served me well. I ended up going from a C student to A's and A pluses. And I had a professor take me under her wing, Dr. Kinamaadiwin. Unfortunately, she passed away in 2014 after I finished my master's program. Anyway, she was also my master's advisor. So she was really kind to me and showed me a lot of support, and so kind of got me through those first couple of programs. But after she died, there was a void in my life. I didn't know what I was going to do after that. Like I had thought about maybe a PhD, but I didn't know what I would focus on. And another thing I thought about was law school. And it just happened one day that, I was, I'm going to go to law school. And so I started studying for the LSAT. And, as you're kind of studying, my mind started to wander, and I'm thinking to myself, like, what would I do with a law degree? And I'm like, certainly I'd go into Aboriginal law. I have to do something in Aboriginal law. And it's like, okay, but Aboriginal law doing what? And again, going back to my undergrad years, thinking about what I learned about treaties. And I was like, you know what, that treaty right to education, it's never been properly implemented. So that's something for me to think about. And all of a sudden, this like kind of light bulb moment, I'm like, wow, I got myself like a PhD idea here. So Dr. Peter Kolchiski, who's a professor in the Department of Native Studies, he became my doctoral advisor. So I told him my idea. He was like, yeah, that's great, let's do it. And so I went through that whole process. And it kind of led me to where I was at. So when I started doing, the coursework and everything, I was very kind of focused on this idea of this treaty right to education. But things switched for me like after a conversation. So after I wrote my comp exams, I reached out to Grand Council Treaty 3, and at the time it was the executive director was this man named Gary Allen. And at the time, I knew that I'd seen that they were like looking to hire somebody in this Department of Education. And so basically I emailed him and I was like, oh, you know what, like I'm, a Treaty 3 citizen, and I do my PhD at University of Manitoba. And this story is actually in the book. But anyway, point is that we had this conversation, and that's when he told me that he's like, the Grand Council is looking to codify their education law. And he's like, is that something you'd be interested in? And just like that, I was like, yes, absolutely. And so that's kind of how everything changed from like the treaty with education into this education law. And it really became like really the basis of this book. So awesome.
Yeah. Well, and also rather than like the treaty right to education, whatever fighting the settler paradigm, like this is part of the resurgence.
Yeah.
Here's our paradigm. Right? And you've articulated it so well. And that's one thing. I mentioned the poetry, but it's also very accessible. And one of the things that I was really struck by was the the orders of laws.
Mm.
And I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are familiar with that, but some of us really aren't familiar in that way. So when I was reading it, I was like, oh, that's how like the laws in my tradition might fit in. But I wonder if you just sort of give us a Cole's notes on the orders of laws.
I'll try and do that. So one of the things I write about in the book, unfortunately, it's fairly brief. It's something I might have to expand upon in future publications. But basically, it's this idea that the Anishinaabe Nation has 4 orders of law, and the first order of law is this sacred law, and this is where it represents our national constitution, which is unwritten and has been maintained for millennia, right? Like basically since time immemorial. And it was something that was given to us by the Creator and is reflected in our creation stories. And this is where we get our worldview, our epistemology, and just like our principles for living the good life, Minobibatu. And so that's really like the heart of this sacred law. And so like everything that follows from that must be compliant with this sacred law. Secondly, we have this, it's called traditional law. And so traditional law is more or less kept by elders and knowledge keepers who practice traditional ceremonies such as like the shaking tent and sweat lodge, and language speakers and people who know our history, where we come from, and these principles of the sacred law. Thirdly, we have it's called Anishinaabe Inaakonigewin. So it's just basically customary law. And so one of the distinguishing features about customary law is that like it's something that is kind of filtered into modern society. Like we hear about these principles today. It's stuff like when you're hunting on the land, don't take more than what you need, save enough for the next generation. Hunt during the appropriate seasons. These are all aspects of Anishinaabe customary law. And you might see some of those kind of principles written down somewhere, but probably not entirely. And then fourth, it's called Ojibwe Inaakonigewin, and that's written temporal law, and that is what we have here, this education law. So this education law flows from these other 3 words. It comes from our creation stories, like the knowledge that we've been passing down from generation to generation, how we wish to teach and learn with others, the next generation, how we interact with each other, and so it's more explicit, and as the name says, written temporal law, like it is literally designed to be written down so that it can be properly understood by other people, right? And I would just add, and I think I already said this, but I'll say it again, that this law is informed by the sacred law that comes before, as well as the traditional law and our customary laws.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple of friends from grad school back here. They're senior citizens now in the back. But one thing that again struck me with your book was you quoted an awful lot of, I guess, early post-colonial writers like Frantz Fanon, Memmi. These were people writing in the 1940s and 1950s, trying to, the French colonists, whoever it might be. And to me, it's really interesting that they're still relevant.
Yes.
Right? I remember in grad school kind of bringing up George Manuel's Fourth World, and our professor's like, whoa, like, it's out of the park, or it's something different. But I guess my question for you is, because you used all those, sort of anti-colonial writers, where do you think we are on that journey here in Canada? Like, I know we're not at the end for sure, but
well, I don't think we'll ever have a truly post-colonial world. But basically, when it comes to the writings of Frantz Fanon and Albert Memmi, like they're like the fathers of, you know, post-colonial theory, and their ideas about colonization and like how to fight against it, while still relevant, not necessarily applicable here in Canada. For example, like Frantz Fanon, like he basically argues for violence, basically saying that the only way how you can decolonize is by literally ejecting the colonizer out. And let's face it, I don't think that's going to happen here in Canada. That said, there are other things that can be done, and we do have great thinkers here in Canada. Like they're more of, I think, called like the resurgent scholars. So these are people like Glenn Coulthard from the Dene Nation, but we also have Leanne Simpson for the Anishinaabe Nation, Taiki Alfred as well, just to name a few examples. And from their perspective, one of the primary aspects of decolonization is kind of going back, you know, to your roots, to your community, and working within that, and again teaching like the next generation. But from my perspective, that's one aspect of it. But at the same time, like I don't know if we can just turn our back in Canada like it doesn't exist. At some point, there has to be that collaboration. There has to be that goodwill and faith that has been talked about in the treaties. So, and it always comes back to living and coexisting with the settler nation, and we have to learn how to, you know, basically live together. So, as far as where we're on that journey, we've made progress. Like if you look at where we were, like if you think about it, the last residential school closed in 1996. That's less than 30 years ago. So to think about like the kind of persecution that Indigenous peoples have been suffering not that long ago, to where we're at today, we've made significant progress, and that's because of the work of people such as Fred, who kind of were key figures in getting the TRC established. And then once the TRC came and they released that final report, the floodgates for reconciliation kind of opened. All of a sudden, the truth was out there, right? And now that we know what had happened before, well, and you can't say everyone knows, right? But like at the same time, that truth is getting out there, and that's really important. But at the same time, we have a lot of work to do to get to reconciliation. So I would say we're just beginning this reconciliation space, and coming back to the book, a key part of that is recognizing and affirming that Indigenous laws exist, and you know, giving them the opportunity to establish their own education system so that they can you know, preserve their cultures, their languages, and traditional beliefs.
So yeah, we're probably getting pretty close to time, but that's one thing I'm sort of one message I took away from your book is that it's very positive, and rather than like, you know, you explain, you know, in detail how things went wrong, but you also provide a step-by-step process for how to fix it, right? We've known there's a path for a long time, but you've actually provided it in an accessible way to do that. So like that's a very positive message. And you know, I actually here's the last question for it. So now with that message, what's your vision? Like what's your, you know, like what do you want operationalized from this book?
Operationalized. I don't even know where to begin, but I know speaking well, like from my experience and where Anishinaabe Nation Treaty 3 is at with regards to this education law, there's still work to be done. Like really, it's still in a draft stage right now. And you can think about it, like time goes by so fast. Like it's already been almost 5 years since I had that first conversation with Gary Allen. And then, you know, a year after that is when I finally came up with like this draft education law. And then COVID happened, and then there's been change in administration. So like there's been all these different kind of things that happen. Meanwhile, there's still a lot of work to do, but I'm hopeful that that we're on that right path, and that I just want to say too, like, you know, I say that this is for the Anishinaabe people, but it's just as much for colonial settlers as well, to understand like what their role is, like how they can contribute to reconciliation. This includes government officials, policymakers, educators on tangible things that can be done. And one of these things is recognizing and affirming that this law, that it exists, and basically turning over the keys so that we can have that education system. And, you know, of course, there's always going to be questions. You know, I've addressed a couple, right? Like as far as like, oh, how's this going to be funded? And nobody likes to hear this idea of tax. But at the same time, if we think about, you know, like the little amount that we would contribute, like as an individual, compared to like the massive amount of positive change that it can contribute to Indigenous communities, like it's really amazing. So that's sort of like my hope, like kind of moving forward.
For sure, for sure. Are there any questions from the audience? One in the back.
And I'm afraid we will have to limit it to a single question, just because we are quite a bit over time, just to ensure that everyone can get their book signed. But
That's important to decide.
My question is, do you think that the current system, such as MFNERC, which is the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center, is it really a start? Or is it a colonial system painted brown? Do you feel that they should change the name from MFNERC to Manitoba First Nations Education Authority? Because we have to start changing the terminologies that we use in our everyday language, let alone English, let alone Anishinaabe.
Okay, thank you so much for that question, and it's an important one. So, as you kind of pointed out, like there are organizations already in place that are doing important work. She mentioned one of the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center, with the possibility of changing its name. In Treaty 3 territory, we also have the Mostly Tribal Council, and these organizations are largely responsible for administering education programs in certain Indigenous communities. And I think one of the problems she's kind of alluding to is that these organizations are government-funded agencies. Therefore, they're subject to government policies. And so like there's extreme, you know, limitations on, you know, what kind of programs they can provide as far as what their budget is, but also how they even spend their money. And therefore, you can make an argument that they're not really that useful or helpful. But at the same time, unfortunately, these are sort of the institutions in place, and although they may not be perfect, we have to find ways to make them work. But at the end of the day, when it comes to making positive change, it really has to come from the people itself. And that includes our youth, of course, you know, the wisdom of our elders. I hate to say someone like myself, but like, but anyone, like any of our community leaders. And we have to drive a message that we know what we want and how to go about it. And it's really about holding the government accountable to like the many promises it makes, including this treaty right to education, including its commitment to fulfill the TRC's calls to action, as well as implementing UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in a good way. And we are making strong progress. Like if you think about 2021, they finally ratified this UNDRIP bill, and at the time they gave the government 2 years to come up with this national action plan on like how this UNDRIP bill is going to work and how UNDRIP was going to interact with Canadian laws and how it would also reflect Indigenous legal orders as well. So the thing is, that was in June 2021. We're already in April 2023, and there has not been a whiff of what this national action plan is going to be. So we're literally 2 months away from when this national action plan is, and we still don't know anything. And to put a shameless plug into the work we're doing here at Faculty of Law, like our theme for this conference that we're organizing is like, what is this national action plan and like, what should it look like? And so these are the kind of questions we're kind of asking right now. And we want to hear from individuals in the community, like scholars, artists, just community leaders, elders, anyone who has an opinion on like what this national action plan has to be so that UNDRIP is implemented in a good way. And so I think that is like a really next important imperative there.
Well, why don't we give Leo another hand? He's got a pen, and I'm sure he'd be happy to sign some books. So thank you, Leo. Thanks for your book. Thanks for being you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you again for you guys filled my heart with joy. So thank you so much.
That was a fantastic evening. Thank you both so very much. And to all of you for your attention and for being here. I know you've all been waiting with bated breath to find out how you can get a book signed. So we're now going to transport Leo to a table beside the cash desk. We'll ask you all just to remain in your place for just 1 second, and then I'll let you know as soon as he's seated, and then you can descend and get your book signed. We do have copies available at the table. We have copies available at our central cash desk. You can get a book signed before you pay for it. We just ask that you please do pay for the book before you leave this event. Otherwise, we're so very grateful to the University of Manitoba Press for helping to make this evening a reality, to Elder Fred Kelly for kicking off the evening with some truly beautiful words, and to all of you once again. Please join me one final time in acknowledging James Daschuk.
That for anyone who wants to, like carry on this celebration, we're meeting at Fiona McCool's here. Actually, we're already like late. The reservation was for 8:15, but hopefully they won't mind, especially if we get a lot of people coming. Right? So hopefully we'll see you guys there.